But if you had competent, honest government, you wouldn't have to be there in the first place. So I think you have to assume that if you're talking about state building, you're talking about working in an environment in which the existing indigenous institutions are weak to non-existent.
Okay. Well, we will come back to the Q&A afterwards, but right now, let's get a little bit of discussion on the underlying subject. So, Claire, you have written. Let's start with. We'll go in order across the right to left. You've written books on what state building involves. You're head of a foundation of increasing state effectiveness. What exactly is state building? What are we talking about this evening?
Well, I think state building is fundamentally about them and not about us. It's about a society regenerating its own governance arrangements, its own institutions. When we get state building wrong, it's when it's all about us. It's about us sending in people, sending in money, sending in things from the outside as if there's nothing there. But I think it's also about understanding what is the role of the state in the 21st century. It isn't about the kind of state building that might have been in the 19th century, because we're living in such a fundamentally different context.
Okay, meaning in what way? What were the old states like, and what are the new states that are not like them?
I think in previous incarnations of how statecraft was understood and what the state, it was fundamentally about providing security, and today it is also fundamentally about providing security, particularly in the parts of the world where that's missing. Citizens across the world, if you can't walk down to the end of the road without fear of being shot in the back of the head, it's security that you want most. But in today's world, particularly in a globalized world where everybody has access to a TV and sees living standards from across the world, expectations of what the state provides have fundamentally changed. Dr. Ghani and I, in our book, say that there are 10 functions of the state today. It could be 7, it could be 11, but we're seeing much higher expectations of both of living standards and of what people expect their lives to be like.
So it's security. So in the old days, you just had to provide security. Now you have to provide security, but a lot of other things as well.
A lot of other things as well. It's about the management of public finances, it's about provision of healthcare, education, and it's about management of the market. What's the right balance between the state and the market in the 21st century? And that's a question that applies as much in Somalia and Afghanistan as it does in the US or Germany today.
Okay. Jim, you've written books, including the Beginner's Guide to Nation Building. What do you think state building is? And by the way, do you think state building, nation building, all these things are separate phenomena, same phenomena, different labels, or what?
Well, I think Americans tend to treat nation and state interchangeably. Europeans who are used to dealing with multinational states tend to make a distinction between nation building, which is creating a sense of identity in a society, perhaps a divided society, and state building, which is about building governmental capacity. In many cases, both are necessary, so it's a fine distinction. I do think that the American experience in Iraq and Afghanistan has tended to hijack these terms and skew the debate. State building, as it's been used in the post-Cold War era, or nation building, whichever one prefers, really is a prescription for dealing with failed states or failing states. And these are states typically that are emerging from civil war, not from invasions and occupations, but from civil wars. Somalia being, the classic case of a failed state. But Haiti, Libya, Sierra Leone, not Libya, Liberia, Sierra Leone, Mozambique, Cambodia. I mean, I could name a couple of dozen of these states that fragmented, Yugoslavia, that fragmented. So how do you restore stability, security, and functioning societies? Clearly, if the state has failed, you need to reconstitute a functioning state, and that's state building by definition. And so I don't think in that sense it's a very controversial concept. If you have a state that's descended into chaos, and if the international community is going to help reconstitute that, a state that can provide services to that society, then state building is clearly the path. how you do it, what instruments you use, the degree to which a peacekeeping component, a military component is essential. These are where the debate tends to take place. I do believe, based on now several dozen experiences since 1989, that we have enough of a case history so that we can make some generalizations that are valid, even if you accept that each of these cases also has unique features.
Bronwyn, we tend to think of state building as a question of political order, and we tend to think of the creation or emergence of a centralized dominant state as the chief vehicle for providing that order, whether it's an indigenous one or whether it's created midway from the outside. You've dealt with a lot of countries in which sort of you have a different situation and almost in which you have different prescriptions. Does political order require a centralized national government with tentacles throughout the entire country?
Yeah, and that's a good question. And when you're talking about Somalia, it's one that comes to mind immediately. Somalia is a country that, when it's experienced centralized government, it's generally been at wars or in a period of great civil unrest. The Siad Barre military dictatorship was one of the worst periods in Somali history, the most brutal. He effectively carried out a genocide on a significant portion of the population. And today, under the transitional federal government, which is only notionally a government, I should point out, once again, the city of Mogadishu has been absolutely leveled. So the Somali experience of this state has really not been a positive one. And you're dealing with a situation in which possibly a majority, although we don't have public opinion polling, this system would be great in Somalia. But we don't know, but we can assume, I think, that a significant amount of the population is going to consider the central state with some degree of fear and skepticism. And it's not only that the central state is difficult, but that when the Somalis talk about reconstituting a state, they often mean parts of Ethiopia and Kenya and Djibouti and Somaliland. So when we're trying to persuade them to rebuild, we're actually, in a way, summoning irredentist ambitions. So we have different concepts of what their state should look like, and I think that immediately raises questions about, can we make any assumptions about what nation building should look like?
So can you have political order can you have a sustainable, healthy political order in a reasonably modern way without a centralized state?
Strangely enough, when the Somalis, in the period after the Civil War, after Black Hawk Down and the withdrawal of humanitarian forces, everyone thought that the state was going to explode, that Somalia would just descend into conflict. But in fact, within several years, the conflict had reduced. Somalia's economic indicators became as good as or comparable to better than neighboring countries. And the extremist groups that had been allied with al-Qaeda disappeared from the country. So it's really a situation in which, in the absence of a state-building intervention, things actually got better. And history doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but it's a good question to ask in the current context.
Well, actually, let's bring you guys in on this. I mean, you talked about state building from the bottom up rather than the top down, and indigenous rather than external. Is it, in a place like Afghanistan, people have said, we shouldn't be trying to build up the central government in Kabul. We should be trying to create some kind of compact or regionalize it or localize it. Do you need to have a strong centralized government along the sort of classic European model to have political order?
I think, and this is where I think it has to fit the context. And in many places, just an indigenous solution isn't going to work, and empirically hasn't worked, and it's about getting the design of the partnership right. I think sometimes we get trapped in a false debate between, is it about centralization or is it about decentralization? If we take a step back, it's about looking at which function should be performed at which level. If it's about who prints the currency and who regulates the money supply, well, you don't want 364 districts each printing their own currency, of course. So that is a centralized function. If it's about who manages $10,000 projects to rebuild the irrigation system, then that's down to the village. So it's about finding the right fit. And if we look at that, then I think we get away from either centralized or decentralized or top down and bottom up. It's both.
So the subsidiarity concept in the EU.
Absolutely. How to make sure that the decision is taken at the lowest level possible. One great example of how this works in practice is a program called National Solidarity Program in Afghanistan, a block grant at the centre, so the trust fund is very centralised with a dual key system. Block grants given to every village. It's now in 28,000 villages, and the villagers decide on their own money. When they want to aggregate upwards, they do. So 187 villages got together to build an irrigation system. 37 villages got together to build a maternity hospital. So you find the right level to do the right task.
Jim, what's your take on this? And particularly in the security arena, can you have a sort of decentralized form, or do you need some kind of central provider, a central leviathan of some kind?
Well, there are European states with weak central governments, Switzerland being a good example, Belgium being another. So there certainly are models where central governments have very limited spheres of activity. I think unless you want people living in a sort of a Hobbesian state of nature, governments are constituted, to provide certain essential services, of which security is the most essential, because without it, none of the other services end up meaning very much. But increasingly, it provides basic education, access to health care, roads, electricity, water, these kinds of things, obviously, that can be provided at the local level as well. But without some kind of human organization, these services aren't going to be provided. I think the problem in dealing with failed states in which the existing order has collapsed in civil war, anarchy, or whatever, is twofold. First of all, many of them would be highly susceptible to federalism in the sense that they are often states built on a number of different nationalities or ethnic or religious groups, and federalism would seem to be made to order. The problem is most of these societies don't have any historical experience with federalism and tend to regard it with skepticism. So, for instance, there were lots of people who thought that the Iraqis, and for that matter the Afghans, really ought to have federal systems, but the fact is they don't want them. They don't want them because they don't understand them, they're afraid of them, they're a Western concept, and so you're probably not going to be able to force them into those molds, even though they make sense. The second is that they're not really capable of returning to the traditional forms of government, whatever they were, because those forms have collapsed and lost credibility. And the only exception I can think of is we liberated Kuwait, we turned it back over to the royal family. Nobody talked about holding elections. They paid for the liberation, they got the liberation, they got the country back, and everybody was happy. The international community was happy, the royal family was happy, and the Kuwaitis were happy, because they still had legitimacy. That's the only case. If you go into Haiti or Sierra Leone or Liberia or the Congo or Sudan or Afghanistan or Iraq, nobody is going to regard the previous regime as acceptable. International community is not going to regard it as acceptable. The population isn't going to regard it as acceptable. So whatever traditional forms of authority there may have been no longer have a purchase. And so holding elections, basing authority on representative government, one man, one vote, really is the only, assuming the international community doesn't want to govern these places forever, really is the only way in which to reconstitute an authority that the population will regard as legitimate.
Okay. Political order in troubled societies, strange places, faraway places with funny names. Americans have a lot of problems, massive budget deficits, we can't even get our own healthcare act together. The administration is overburdened, our own institutions are not really working much. Why should, however interesting, hypothetically, curious the subject is, why, and however important to the locals, why should Americans care about this, and what, if anything, can the American government do about this?
Well, I think you can make a good economic case for state building generally. As I said, I think the argument in this country gets hijacked by the interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan. People tend to identify those and the cost with those and therefore dismiss it. But the fact is that states in civil war are states in negative economic growth. That is, a state that's having a civil war is going to produce less each year than it did the year before. It's going to depress its own GDP, it's going to depress the GDP of every country around it. Not as much, but all of those countries are going to suffer from having the chaos, the refugees, the endemic disease, the terrorism, and the commercial disruption of having a failed state on their doorstep. The actual costs of UN peacekeeping missions and of multinational assistance in various forms of state building in these kinds of societies is rather low when compared with the cost to the international economy of allowing these states to continue to be in chaos. The fact is that relatively small armed forces made up largely of countries, third world countries, and relatively modest levels of assistance have turned around a dozen or more countries. And countries like some of the ones I named, Cambodia, Sierra Leone, Liberia, Bosnia, Kosovo, Macedonia, Cambodia, and 4 or 5 others are living in peace today. And almost all of them are living under freely elected representative governments because UN troops came in, separated the combatants, disarmed the contending factions, secured economic growth, promoted the development of political parties, organized elections, and then stayed around long enough to make sure the resultant governments could take hold.
Brahman and Claire, would you basically agree with that argument for why this is something people should care about? Or are there other reasons, or do you disagree with what he said?
I would play devil's advocate just for the sake of doing it. I think one concern in the African context, and this applies to a lot of countries, which Somalia is only one, is that many African states simply do not have the tax revenues to support a central regime. And when you start off by creating a central government, be it in Ethiopia or Somalia, you're in a sense raising the specter of an almost perpetual dependency on the international aid community. I mean, Ethiopia, for example, gets 80% of its budget, its federal budget, from donations. And of course you have a huge debt burden also that develops from this. And I think that there's some question about, especially in a place like Somalia, where 60% of the population is illiterate, and that's an optimistic estimate. Whether forming a central state and then hoping that they can link themselves into the global economy is necessarily the most logical solution to their problem. So,
Claire, people have said that about Afghanistan as well, which is that the state we're giving them and the security forces we're envisioning are something that's way more than the Afghan regime is ever going to be able to pay for itself. So is this just basically sort of benevolent neocolonialism paid for permanently from the outside?
Well, I think, if we look at these places or these contexts in terms of a sovereignty gap, we have an international order which is dependent, where we assume that countries are sovereign. Dr. Ghani and I think there are these 10 factors of sovereignty, and if we had to boil it down to an essence, it's the capability of the society to raise enough revenue to pay for the services the citizens expect of it. So it's that revenue self-sufficiency that's absolutely critical for sustainability. If we don't want these places to be a permanent ward of the donor community, I agree absolutely with the ambassador that the reasons that all of us need to care about disorder and chaos in these places are the enormous costs in humanitarian terms, in terms of the people and the suffering. And I think the current debate's got away from that. The basic cost in human suffering, and the reasons that we should be compassionate about it. In hard security terms, we should worry about it because the security threats are there. And in economic terms, the cost to the global economy and the cost to the US and the cost to the world of these places failing is inordinately high, and the cost of having the right solution is better. I think the good news is that there are ways that these places can be dealt with much, much cheaper than what we're doing at the moment. The way that we're applying military force, but more importantly, the way we're applying aid is not working, and we're paying far too much. Coming on to foreign aid, particularly, we're spending billions of dollars in many of these places on private companies and NGOs with enormous budgets and little accountability, when instead we should be looking at how does that country grow its own economy, raise its own revenue, and pay for its own services. Many of these contexts only spend about 10 or 20% of their own domestic budgets. So the central question is, how do you get, and it's a boring topic, it's about accountancy, how do you get the public finance system of the country working properly?
Jim, you say these things have been relatively easy and relatively cheap. She says it can be done even more cheaply. You know, it's funny because I look around at the most recent American interventions and they seem like royal screw-ups that have cost vast amounts of money and produced very few positive results. Why, if it's possible to do this well, competently, relatively cheaply, do we keep screwing up?
Well, I wouldn't say Bosnia and Kosovo were screw-ups. I'd say they're still somewhat dependent on international aid. But the Balkans are at peace and have been at peace now for more than a decade, 15 years in the case of Bosnia. So, I mean, I think if you're just talking about the American experience, there are successful cases as well as more controversial ones. I think there is a difference between peacekeeping and peace enforcement. And one is, on average, 10 times more expensive than the other. The definition is peacekeeping is consensual. The parties have stopped fighting briefly, they're exhausted, they're prepared to invite in a referee, accept an international mediation and an international peacekeeping force, the purpose of which is to make sure that the parties actually implement the peace agreement they've agreed to. Those are conditions for a peacekeeping force. That's what the UN usually requires before it sends troops in. And if you have those basic prerequisites, then the costs and challenges are more limited. And basically, you're at that point guarding against recidivism. If, on the other hand, you are going to have to mount an invasion before you initiate the peacekeeping, because the parties aren't prepared to stop fighting, haven't reached an agreement, or for some other reason, then you don't have the advantage. You, the intervening force, don't have the advantage of impartiality that the UN usually enjoys. And as the result, it requires to succeed, and it can succeed. It has succeeded. Germany, Japan after the Second World War, Bosnia, Kosovo. It requires, on average, our studies suggest about 10 times more manpower and 10 times more money. So it's much more expensive. Now, there are times when you're simply not prepared to let them fight it out and wait until they've reached exhaustion, at which point it becomes much more cost-effective to intervene. And that's one of the reasons why people have been very frustrated that the international community hasn't sorted out Darfur. Well, the fact is that it would be very expensive to go in and force them to stop fighting, and nobody's been willing to do that. They do seem to be stopping fighting now, and the peacekeeping force has a good chance of preventing them from resuming. But it's been a difficult and costly 10 years, but probably not as costly as going in and bombing them into submission and then occupying the territory.
So the choice is sort of let them fight it out with all the horrors that involves, or go in and do it yourself and sit on them in a sort of benign imperial invention and hope that eventually it works.
And accept the higher costs.
Accept
In addition, scale matters. Bosnia, population of 3 million. Kosovo, a population of 2 million. Afghanistan, a population of 33 million. So, Iraq, a population of 25 million. So 10 times bigger. And logically, it would require 10 times more troops and 10 times more money. But we put 50,000 troops into Kosovo, a society of 2 million, most of whom loved us. So that would have scaled that up. That's 500,000 or 600,000 for Iraq or Afghanistan. We didn't do that.
So we can do it almost sort of seriously, but it's a lot of investment for a small community, and so for really big countries, you can't really do it easily. So it's not like there's a model on the shelf you could do Sudan. There's no model on the shelf you could easily take off.
You can do peacekeeping in a big country, but peace enforcement, no.
So Congo is screwed, basically.
Until the conditions for peacekeeping apply, which they do in most of the Congo, but not all of it.
Okay. This is a very bleak picture. Well, it's both encouraging and bleak. Encouraging for small, easy problems in small places we can help, and big problems in big, nasty places we can't do much about. Is that basically what you guys are saying?
Let someone else talk.
I'm a little bit more cautiously optimistic. I think if we look now at the case of Afghanistan, one of the misperceptions is that Afghanistan has been at war consistently for the last 8 years. If we pass it out a little bit more, there was a war that was finished. It was started in October 2001 and was finished in November 2001. The Taliban had gone. Then there was pretty much a peace agreement. It wasn't called a peace agreement, it was the Bonn Agreement to establish legitimate institutions. And for about 4 or 5 years, the main effort was somewhere in between reconstruction, state building, and peacekeeping. But a very small number of troops were committed, and they were confined to Kabul. So what the Afghans requested was peacekeeping forces across the country and the other cities. That didn't happen. But perhaps even more fatally, the investment on the civilian side didn't happen. Aid came, and humanitarian aid came, but most of that aid, I'd say 80 or 90% of it, actually stayed in the Beltway. It went to companies, it went to NGOs. Most of it stayed in the US and European capitals. 20% of each level may have only gone on overheads, but by the time you've subcontracted 4 or 5 times down the chain, very little's getting to the context. What didn't happen was funding the civilian institutions that did exist in the country. So back in 2001-2, there was a functioning civil service. The Taliban had just been the top there. There were 240, I went around the country, there were 240,000 civil servants, policemen, teachers, nurses, doctors, who'd been there since the 60s. $20 million went to pay the salaries. So we couldn't pay teachers, doctors even $50 a month. They left. So in fact, what we've seen is an exercise in state destruction sponsored by the international community because we didn't resource the civilian institutions. I think it would have cost $200 or $300 million to get it right. So that's a bleak picture. Optimistically, it wouldn't have taken very much investment. And I think if we look back at where countries have transformed in the last 2 or 3 decades, what were the key factors of success? It was leadership and management of the national leaders. Where that comes from is a very important question. I don't think we know the answer. But it was about investment in human capital of the country, the people of the country, vocational training, higher education, secondary schools. We don't do that now. We do primary education. We stop at the age of 11. How are countries going to manage themselves if we only educate to the age of 11? And it was about investment in job creation, domestic firms and so on. So if we look at the cases of Singapore, of Spain, of the States and the American South, all these cases, those were the factors, and I think we need to learn those lessons. If we do, then I think it's possible.
Okay, this raises an absolutely fascinating methodological question, and I can't believe I just said methodological in an FA event, but still, what you're saying is you can't just code the Afghan case based on what happened because there was another path that could have been taken that would have led to a fundamentally different outcome. In some ways, Bronwyn's Somalia work, people coded it as a failure, but then when it was supposedly a failure, it righted itself without external involvement in a dramatic way. So that could be how do you actually, I mean, Jim, you study these things, you do the history of the cases. How do you take into account the counterfactual paths that could have happened? When you say in Afghanistan, I mean, according to Claire, it didn't have to be the disaster that it is, or the mess that it is at least, because if it had been done properly, it would have been a success.
And in 2005, just to clarify, when a group of Afghans came over to Washington and European capitals and said, look, we think this is going to collapse. Leaders at the time were saying, no, we're bringing our troops in, it's all stable now. So for a period of time, it at least appeared to be a success.
So how do we draw proper lessons from history if the history itself is in dispute because there are other paths that weren't taken?
I don't know that, I mean, at least, within the academic literature, there's not all that much disagreement except on details. I think we, at RAND have looked back at cases over the last 60 years, since 1945, established 2 basic criteria for success. Most important one is the place of peace today, or has civil war resumed? And the second one is it being governed by a representative, freely elected government? And so you can divide the several dozen cases since the Second World War into by those 2 criteria. And then you look at what the strategies were by the intervening powers, normally international coalitions, and determine what seems to have worked and what seems not to have worked. And there is a set of best practices. The UN has established a best practices unit. It's created a doctrine. The US has been more haphazard in that regard. The Clinton administration, which began this really in the post-Cold War era, conducted 4 operations and got steadily better. Somalia was a complete failure. Haiti was a well-run but of little enduring value. Bosnia and Kosovo were more enduring value. But it didn't pass that expertise on to its successor. Its successor was critical of state building and nation building and came in determined to do it not at all, or if necessary, at least to do it very differently. And so it too had to go through the same learning curve. And if you look at US performance in Iraq in 2003 and then in 2007, you say, well, the Bush administration got a lot better at this. But it took them 8 years to get better at it. I think we're fortunate that Obama didn't go back to the bottom again, but built on what the Bush administration had achieved. And there's much more continuity in the way he's approached these than the way the last 2 administrations have. And if we're lucky, we will create a cadre of experts with a continuity of experience and create a doctrine, as the UN has done, for the conduct of these operations based on best practices.
So a sort of stable of experienced imperial managers to actually carry out our interventions and make them work over time. Let me ask a couple of questions before turning it over to the audience for their questions. First, we hear sometimes about, Americans are always like to talk about their own screw-ups, their own failures, their own successes. There's a whole world out there, and there's a sense that multilateralism, international legitimacy, international institutions are important to this process. How important is the multilateral dimension to this, to these efforts? Can the U.S. do it by itself if it does it right, or is what we do less important than who we do it with and the legitimacy that comes from backing of a serious international institution? Both open to any of you.
Sure. I mean, I wouldn't mind sort of jumping in on that. I think the multilateral approach is very, very important, particularly when you're talking about a situation and when the actions of any one particular country might be perceived as partisan. The United States, for example, in Africa has its own agenda, and having the backing of the United Nations or the African Union in the sense that there's more than a single agenda at play is very important. At the same time, what constantly has been occurring to me when I've been listening to this dialogue is we talk about nation building and cases where there's been successes, and what seems really clear to me is that there's nation building and there's nation creating. And we're talking about the successes of nation building, you're talking about starting from a fairly good place. And when we've tried in cases like Somalia and Haiti to really work on creating a government from scratch, that's where we haven't succeeded very well. And often that has a lot to do with the amount of resources that come into play. Creating a state not only requires that you somehow motivate a population to pursue this goal, but it also is tremendously expensive. And I can't imagine that any single country, including the United States, can really fund that. So it has to be a collective effort at bottom.
Would you guys agree on that? Just on multilateralism?
I think so. There's been a lot of discussion, particularly in the Afghan context, but also now in looking at the real tragedy in Haiti, on the coordination problem. And often a solution to the coordination problem is to put one country in charge, and that's often, if not always, going to revert to the US as the superpower and the country with the resources and clout to do that. Having said that, if we're looking at a growing caseload of countries that are in chaos and disorder and have governance problems, and depending on which index you look at, it's somewhere between 40 and 60 countries. The thought of America leading on each of those, especially in the current economic climate, is just not feasible. So I think, therefore, one, the imperative to look at smarter and perhaps cheaper, more cost-effective ways of approaching these countries and being much more catalytic mechanisms rather than direct management is important, and looking at ways to organize collective efforts through different ways of forming alliances, not to mention the BRICS and new players in the aid and foreign policy agenda through emerging powers. We haven't yet mentioned the role of China in Africa, for example. So looking at new players and how they might engage with the challenge, and also looking to multilateralism. On the UN, I mean, if you read the Charter today, never has it been more relevant. We need the UN. We couldn't reinvent it today if we had to. Yet it's an organisation in crisis, and I think particularly the role of the specialised agencies and the lack of accountability. If we follow the money, I think we'd all be shocked. And this is an agenda not only of the right, but as much of the left, to bring accountability to UN agencies, and not least in the case of Somalia. I've been receiving emails from Mogadishu saying, please help us build a public finance system so the UN agencies stop stealing all our money. So the huge imperative to bring accountability to the UN agencies, and I think to bring back the World Bank and IMF and some of the development banks, and the role of economics, regional economics, and the way that can play a really important role in peacekeeping itself. I interviewed recently many SRSGs who'd led peacekeeping efforts in the last 10 years, and all of them said their biggest... Special Representative, Secretary General, the UN representative, and all of them said that their biggest mistake was to think that economics could wait for 10 years. Instead, what you got was the formation of a criminal mafia elite. You didn't create jobs. So bringing the World Bank, IMF into this space in the right way, I think, is critical.
One last question for me before we turn it over to you guys. As one of the questions indicated, if you take a look at Afghanistan, our local partners there seem to be part of the problem rather than perhaps part of the solution. What happens when your local allies are themselves corrupt, quasi-authoritarian, not particularly effective? How do you manage to encourage your friends, even at the same time that you're defeating your enemies?
But you wouldn't have to be there in the first place. So I think you have to assume that if you're talking about state building, you're talking about working in an environment in which the existing indigenous institutions are weak and to non-existent. In the case of Afghanistan, they were non-existent 8 years ago. This is the problem. It's not an aberration. It's not, well, gee, how can we possibly succeed with a corrupt, incompetent government? The governments are always corrupt and incompetent, and yet there is a reasonable success rate. If by success you mean the place hasn't gone back into civil war, it continues to hold elections, and the people who get elected, get to govern for 4 or 5 years before there's a new election. Those aren't very high standards, but they are important standards, and they're standards that are consistently met in many of these countries, including virtually all of the ones that I've named. It's particularly difficult, obviously, if you're in a counterinsurgency environment, which you're in Afghanistan and Iraq, which exacerbates the problem and drives the costs up very significantly.
And you're not saying that just because you personally picked Karzai? What would you say about the question of how do you reform your enemies even as you're defeating, how do you reform your friends even as you're defeating your enemies?
I think it's the greatest challenge in these contexts. It's a really, really hard question. And I think the key to it, very difficult to operationalize, is a concept of accountability. It comes back to that boring topic of public finance, a lot of it. And a lot of it, I think, instead of having global leaders discuss the question of corruption, we go back to the technocratic element. Of course it's political, but it's about revenue and budget and procurement and expenditure. How, with a recent discovery in Afghanistan of possibly up to $1 trillion worth of mineral assets, how are those going to be, what's going to be the right framework so that the benefit of that goes to the population of the country to pay for their future services for the population? So it's those types of questions that are really critical. And I think the hope is, in so many of these countries, we're looking at statistics of 60 to 65% of the country being under 25. There's a new generation coming. It's a very different generation, and it comes again back to investing in the universities, the vocational training, and investing in the youth, and broadening our concept of what leadership means. Often in these places, we always look at one leader. No one leader runs any country. And I think we need to broaden the telescope to look at broader conceptions of institutions, the cabinet, the ministries, and the parliament and civil society, and take a much wider view on what leadership means.
Okay. Well, speaking of the next generation, you want to jump in on this?
Yeah. I mean, I think basically that this is a key question in the East African context, because in practice, when you're talking about nation building in East Africa, what it comes down to is a process of picking a winner and defeating a loser. And once you've gone through this picking of the winner, and it turns out you have someone that you're willing to work with, it becomes very, very hard to rein them in. But a phrase you constantly hear in the Somali context is that this government that we've created there is the only game in town. And it's just perceived that there's no alternative to working with them. And it's hugely problematic, because once you're the only game in town, you don't really have any incentive to do anything except what's in your own best interest. In the Ethiopian context, they're coming up on elections, and you have a government which is no longer a democracy by any real meaning of the word. And there's people, opposition leaders being arrested, opposition leaders being stabbed, there's no freedom of the press. And yet the US government, because Ethiopia is so important in our counter-terror struggle, and because it feels it has no leverage, is really not even able to publicly criticize the Ethiopian government. And when you get to that stage, when that's such a real dynamic, you have to ask whether state building doesn't start looking a lot, in a sense, like Cold War politics or colonialism even. And again, I understand East Africa, is fundamentally different than other contexts because it's so under-resourced. And nation building is really, it's almost not even fair to call it nation building, I think. It's another point to bring up. But
So it's the old friendly tyrant problem in a different guise.
it feels like that, yeah.
Well,
I do think it's worth mentioning, though, that the incidents of conflict in Africa have gone down dramatically over the last 20 years. We read about the chronic cases, Congo, Sudan, and Somalia. But the fact is that the number of conflicts in Africa are probably a third of what they were 15 years ago. The number of people getting killed in Africa as a result of civil war is probably reduced even more dramatically. And this is almost entirely the result of UN. The peacekeeping component of those successes has almost been entirely under UN leadership.